friends, I am Dr. Kuldeep Mohadikar. In this video, I will present my 32nd chapter from my series Literary Pearls. The chapter is entitled as Robert Browning's Obscurity. One of the most famous and misleading charge against Browning's poetry is that it is obscure and is difficult to understand. Due to some critics like Arthur Seaman, Chesterton, Mrs. Orr, and others called him an obscure poet. In his own age, Browning was considered very difficult and obscure poet. When Browning's Sardello was published, it was regarded as hopelessly obscure poem and more obscure than any other poems in our English language. Tennyson made the well-known and oft-repeated quip that he understands only two lines of it. The opening line, I quote, "Who will may hear Sardello's story told," I unquote, and the final, I quote, "Who would has heard Sardello's story told," I unquote. Carlyle also protested that his wife had it through without being able to make out whether Sardello was a man, a city, or a book. In the life and works of Browning, we do not have any evidence to show that he had proved in his power and contempt of his readers. It was not fame that made to choice obscurity, as Chesterton argued. Browning obscurity had altogether oppositely origin, all that which usually assigned in it. He was humble, he was an intelligible, not because of his vague thoughts, but because to him they were obvious. He thought that ideas were familiar, therefore he did not care to explain them. He tasked his familiarity for granted because his inward clarity. Browning never thought that his ideas were his discoveries. He felt that everyone held his ideas. Hence, Chesterton says, I quote, "Outward obscurity is in a young author a mark of inward clarity," I unquote. One of the most important reasons of Browning's obscurity is to be found in style. His style is unfamiliar to all the average readers. He ignores the prepositions, the conjunctions, and leaves much to be guessed. The obscurity is to be given his own reference, is involved in the manner and in his writing. He omits necessary word and leaves of extravagance of suit. Many times his thoughts are buried under the appropriate hand and faulty phrase. Secondly, Browning found his subject under the remark and out of his areas of experience. The themes of his poems are far-fetched and remote to understand. The Grammarian's Funeral is, one must be well known conversant with the Renaissance period. Many of Browning's poems are heavily overloaded with his stupendous learning. His allusions are not easily traceable. He refuses to speak out, and therefore critics accuse him of obscurity. The champions of Browning's defend him by refusing this charge of obscurity. Browning is a poem of entertainment and assessment, means he is poet of entertainment and assessment. His philosophical thoughts are not expected to be closed in a language of a love song. Browning is a very fine reply to Ruskin's criticism that, I quote, "all poetry puts infinite within finite." He expected the readers to keep pace with his thinking. The thoughts and emotions of the poet move rather fast. To catch them are so difficult. Ideas are fused all too suddenly. This can be clear only to one who goes through poem patiently. Someone called Browning's poems machines puzzles. Really, they are difficult to understand. There are various types of causes which bring obscurity in Browning's poetry, which may be as follows. When we try to search cause for Browning's obscurity, we may firstly come across faulty grammar of Browning. We may firstly to come across the faulty grammar of Browning. He never bothered about grammar. He made uses involved and clumsily constructed sentences. His habit of omitting who, which, on, etc. proves a serious handicap to understanding of his poems. In his poem Grammarian's Funeral, he not only buries the grammarian but also buries innocent grammar. Browning had a very high conception of his own calling. He did not care to cater to the taste of the reading public, who were used to the easy and smooth use of verse or poems or poetry of Tennyson. According to his view, poetry was never been generally understood, but the poet should not care for it. His business is with God to whom he is accountable. Thus, Browning's theory of poetry accounts to some extent for the difficult nature of his poetry. Browning's monologues are best known for their obscurity. He makes the heroes speak without giving suggestion to circumstances. Hence, we totally fail to understand his speech and meaning. Another reason for Browning's obscurity is that he often leaves his sentences half finished and his meaning half expressed. That's why we fail to understand the meaning. In my Last Duchess tells to the messenger, I quote, "Oh sir, she smiled no doubt whenever I passed her, but who passed without much the same smile? I gave commands, then all smiles stopped together." I unquote. In these lines, the Duke says after his orders her smile should stop. But how did the smile stop? What were the orders he gave? And the poet left the meaning obscure. Browning was a very learned poet, and his learning is stumbling block in the way of his readers. His schooling was mostly private. He had gone through all the stupendous dictionary of Dr. Johnson, and his knowledge of history was encyclopedia in its vastness. As his readers lack such a vast and exhaustive knowledge, they find him obscure. Often Browning writes a telegraphic style. Relatives, prepositions, articles, even pronouns are left out. At other times, words are contracted, participles are clipped, and vowels are suppressed. Such telegraphic style is certainly confusing and bewildering for his readers. Though Browning appears to be obscure to his Victorian contemporaries, he does not appear to be obscured to the modern age. Browning is far brilliant and subtle by his psychological processes and his preoccupation with the intricacies and subtleties of psychological processes. Therefore, he appears obscure. Someone has called Browning had a great love about the intricate forms of Elizabethans. Browning's lines are deep and sharp and therefore difficult to understand. This was all about from my side Robert Browning as an obscure poet. Thanks friends.